appropriate later on.
I'm surprised, actually, that anybody has been able to check whether this bill is compliant with human rights legislation, because there's nothing in the bill. I genuinely thought, I try very hard to read the legislation that's coming before us, and I've got tomes and I can't do it, and I'm not in a party, so I've got no one to outsource it to or anything, right? And I didn't have much trouble with this one because there's nothing in it. And that, in a way, is the problem. So actually, although I actually am not keen on human rights legislation, I disagree with the Noble Baroness Lady Chakrabarti on the fact that this is some big conspiracy against human rights legislation, but I can't tell what I think about this bill in relation to that. And I think it is the problem with the skeletal nature of the bill, because actually, forget the human rights aspect, employment rights are important to millions of people in this country, and they were long fought for, hard fought for. And if there's a risk they're being taken away, we're not all just going to sit here and go, well, we'll trust you, even though you haven't written it in the bill. So that's the problem. And I do think that there's all so many questions that I've got, at one point in the second reading, the Minister stressed that process of consultation would be required before regulations on maintaining services, minimum service levels would be introduced. But consultation with who? The fact that we're discussing minimum services and we don't know what the minimum services are. I mean, is it 90% of services? Is it 50%? Different services, different... And so it makes it open to conspiratorial, what are they up to, question marks. It's inevitable that's what's going to happen. And all the time, you just keep thinking that the consequence of this is that overstretched public services are going to have to assess these minimum services, which I think is going to waste endless amounts of their time when we've got a crisis in public services. But then named individuals who were persuaded to vote for strike action, which is perfectly within their right, persuaded in as much as there's an argument, will I go on strike or not? You decide to go on strike, that's quite a big thing to decide to do, I think. And then you're named by your employer as somebody who has to strike break and cross a picket line. And if you refuse to do that, which, by the way, strike breaking and crossing picket lines for some of us is a point of principle that we will not do, right, as an aside, right? It's a big deal for us, generally. And if you don't do it, you jeopardise everybody else's employment rights and get the union sued. So you can understand that bit. Anyway, one bit of clarification. I just don't know why we need the bill. And there's nothing in the bill to tell me why we need the bill, because, and this relates, I think, to some of the points that were made by the front benches in the opening point, is it not the case that many of the sectors mentioned in this bill already have their own minimum service requirements? Often voluntary, sometimes not voluntary, even in relation to the fact that only in 2019, in the Queen's speech, we were told that we needed a bill to ensure that people could depend on their transport networks, and they were trying to do minimum service in transport. And at the time, I thought, why are they picking on transport workers? But the point was, they felt it was so important they had to mention transport. Now they're just throwing in everybody else, right? So it's changed from any kind of democratic requirement. Then it would imply, oh, that's because more people have gone on strike, but then it does come over as a bill to stop strikes. Surely that's one of the problems. But we've got the Fire and Rescue Services Act of 2004, which allows the Secretary of State to provide and maintain services and facilities in fire and rescue situations. That was given to him. I didn't agree with it, but you've got it. In the education sector, there's various statutory duties on schools regarding safeguarding and supervision of children and so on. And don't get me wrong, I don't agree with all the strikes that have been called recently. I'm not in those unions. I might argue against them, but that's not the point. We're talking about fundamental rights. It's not human rights. They're employment rights, long established, and a bill that doesn't tell us which ones are being taken away are inevitably going to have the government cast as people who are indifferent to workers' rights. And by the way, I have defended the government on the EU retained law bill when people have said you're using this to smash workers' rights. And I've said, don't be so conspiratorial. I'm not helped in defending you on that when you bring this bill forward, which is about attacking workers' rights.
Could I just respond briefly to